Okay, this is the Steel Revolution Objective 2 about how Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, depending on who you're talking to. There's a couple different ways you can say his last name. I think he actually used to pronounce it Carnegie, but other people around him called him Carnegie. Either way, how Andrew Carnegie dominated the post-Civil War steel industry. Now, Carnegie himself, and here's a picture of him here nearing his retirement years, is the quintessential American dream story. Carnegie actually came to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at the age of 13 in 1848. His native country was Scotland, and when he came to the United States in 1848, he had some ideas about what he wanted to do with his life. The biggest thing about Carnegie, even at a young age, is that he was an extremely, extremely hard worker. By the way, this is Carnegie with his brother. Here's Carnegie over here on the right, the older one. He had very strong ideas about ethics, particularly work ethic, morals, things like that, and he built himself up. What Carnegie basically did is that he would work all day long, working just, again, with the strong work ethic that he had. He'd go hard at his job all day long, and then he'd go to night school at night to get his basic degree. As Carnegie got older, he got a chance to start off in the railroad industry. The guy that would become famous for his dealings in steel gets started in the railroad itself with a guy that we actually heard about in the lesson about the railroad industry a while back, Tom Scott, who was Cornelius Vanderbilt's biggest rival in the railroad industry. Carnegie, when he originally worked for Tom Scott, was just a messenger boy. But Scott took an interest in the kid because he saw, again, a very strong work ethic with him. And that's something that Carnegie got to be well known for, as did Vanderbilt and Rockefeller and everybody else that we're talking about with these lessons. But Tom Scott decided he wanted to give Andrew Carnegie an opportunity. And so because of that, Carnegie got to rise up the ranks in Tom Scott's railroad. Now, sooner or later, Carnegie is going to accumulate enough capital, enough money of his own and potential investors to get started in the new steel business. Carnegie recognized fairly quickly after Tom Scott's demise started to take place, as it did for many railroad men, that the railroad was starting to turn into a passing industry, or would soon become a passing industry. Railroads were being overbuilt, and so getting involved in the railroad or trying to secure a decent cargo to maintain your railroad business, like Vanderbilt had with Rockefeller's oil, was becoming less and less possible. Carnegie took a look at everything and saw that people were demanding steel for the railroads, for the bridges, for the infrastructures, for the new skyscrapers, and decided that was what he wanted to get into. And he got into it in a big way. This is just outside of Pittsburgh, the Homestead Steel Works in Pennsylvania, which was Carnegie's most famous steel plant. Carnegie did extremely well for himself in the steel business, but he did not like following the model that John D. Rockefeller had. Rockefeller had formed a monopoly by crushing his opposition and buying everybody out. Well, that was not Carnegie's game. He didn't like monopolies. He greatly disliked trusts. And so what he decided to do instead was to choose to have a partnership of about 40 Pittsburgh area millionaires. By 1900, his group was dividing an annual income of $40 million in profits. And Carnegie's share of that annual $40 million was a very cool $25 million for him. After all, he's the one who got everybody else involved and made them rich without crushing their business. That was awfully nice of him. I guess he was kind of entitled to have a little more of the share for himself. But Carnegie was a pioneer in American business for a couple other reasons as well. The main one was Carnegie's concept of vertical integration. Now, the way vertical integration works is that you decide you're going to own businesses at every stage of the production process. For example, if you're an industry that sells meat, Ace Meat Industries right here, you've got to have delivery wagons, meat packing plants, cooled warehouses, refrigerated railroad cars, slaughterhouses, and cattle ranches. Now, if you are dealing with other businesses to get those things, remember that the standard markup in any kind of of business is usually 100% overproduction cost. That means, and look at all these stages on this process here, that means if you have to buy cattle, you're buying it marked up at 100%. To slaughter it, you're paying for that service marked up 100%. To ship it by railroad car, you're paying for that service marked up at 100%. The warehouse marked up at 100%. The meat packing plant marked up. The delivery wagon marked up. All in all, by the time it gets to you, you're paying an awful lot of money along the way. You're paying everybody's marked up prices. But if you're the one who owns the cattle ranch, if you're the one who owns the slaughterhouse, the railroad car, the warehouse, the meat packing plant, delivery wagon, well, you're not going to overcharge yourself. You're going to pay wholesale prices. So if you own every stage of, or every business at the stage of production or the process of production, then in the end, you save yourself a lot of money. This was something that Carnegie was a master at. He owned his own iron ore mines, he owned his own steel foundries, things like that. So the Carnegie model of doing business became known as vertical integration. It's one of the two major business models that exists in America today. The other one is horizontal integration, and this is what John D. Rockefeller did. By buying up and crushing all the oil companies around him, he built a monopoly. He built his business that way. All of these businesses were on the same level as him, but they weren't below him in any way. He wasn't buying up oil fields or oil wells. He was just buying up other refineries. If you're buying things that are all on the same level, that is called horizontal integration, and that was the Rockefeller model. The vertical model was the one that Carnegie used. Now, both of these are standard business models today with great impacts on the American business industry. Now, eventually, Carnegie got kind of tired of all the wars that went on with Rockefeller. You know, for example, Rockefeller threatened to get into the steel business. He forced Carnegie into buying some worthless iron ore mines to prevent Rockefeller from getting into the steel business. Basically, it was a lot of battles. And after a while, Carnegie gets tired and weary of fighting everybody in business all the time and would like to retire. Well, he does so in 1901 by selling Carnegie Steel, by selling his company to this guy, J.P. Morgan, for about, now listen to this, $480 million, which in today's money would be $13.5 billion. Sold all of that to J.P. Morgan. Now, J.P. Morgan was no fool. He consolidated Carnegie Steel with some other steel companies he had bought and turned it into what we know today as U.S. Steel, which ended up being the first company in American history to turn $1 billion in annual profits. So it was a good deal for J.P. Morgan, too. Both guys got what they wanted. Morgan got to take Carnegie Steel, the most famous steel company at the time, combine it with others, and make it into an even bigger steel company. And as for Carnegie, he got to retire in peace. He got his $480 million from J.P. Morgan, and that $13.5 billion in today's dollars, added to the fortune that he already had, brought his net worth in today's money, brought his net worth to $310 billion. By comparison, Bill Gates is worth about $65 billion today, just to give you an idea of how rich this guy is. But Carnegie, probably more so than most of the major captains of industry or robber barons or whatever you want to call them of the time, had a pretty strong ethical streak. And Carnegie, although he didn't always have the best reputation for dealing with his labor force very well, which wasn't really his fault. Carnegie used to go back to Scotland for much of the year and kind of let the business run on autopilot under a guy named Henry Frick. And Frick was the guy who was really brutal to the labor force. More on that in future lessons. In any event, Carnegie, despite his reputation with his workers, which wasn't always great, actually felt for the common man. And he also felt like he had way more money than he could ever possibly do anything with. It was Carnegie who in 1889 wrote an article or a book called The Gospel of Wealth. And in The Gospel of Wealth, Carnegie said, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." It was his sincere belief that the wealthy should try to improve society. And as far as Carnegie was concerned, like I said, he had way more money than he could ever possibly do anything with. And so Carnegie becomes the leader of a philanthropy revolution among the wealthy. He donated eventually $360 million, which was $5 billion in today's money, to various charitable causes. Didn't really make a dent in what he had as far as overall worth, but it was far more than anybody had ever donated at the time. And to keep up with him, because the public started to like his image with this, people like Rockefeller and other philanthropists, other industrialists, I should say, got much more involved with donations and philanthropies. Rockefeller actually lived to be a lot older than Carnegie, and in the end actually ends up donating more than even Carnegie did. So what was it that Carnegie donated to? Well, Carnegie's favorite pursuit was education. As a young man, he valued it greatly, and so he felt like his money should be going toward educational causes. There are high schools named after him in this country right now, and various other educational ventures, but his favorite thing were libraries. Carnegie loved libraries, and so he routinely donated money for various libraries to be put up. This is the Decane Library near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was one of the first ones that he had. But he also expanded the Carnegie Foundation, which was responsible for donating this money, expanded it to various other areas as well. Washington, D.C. is still the home to a Carnegie Library. Kansas City, Kansas got a Carnegie Library with funds that Carnegie had allowed them to have. Expanding further out, Houston, Texas was the site of a Carnegie Library. Duluth, Minnesota, just in getting into farther rural areas, way up by Lake Superior, was the home of a Carnegie Library. And even today, Boise, Idaho has a Carnegie Library. Now, in 1900, if Carnegie was willing to give money to a library in Boise, Idaho, and have one constructed there, there was a chance you could have a Carnegie Library in almost any city in America, no matter where it was, maybe even as far as Alaska. I don't know if there was ever one there, but Carnegie was popping up libraries all over the place. And of course, Carnegie set up one of his best libraries in his beloved hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh is still, and it's, I don't know if you can read it on the slide, but it says free to the people. That was the whole idea, was that Carnegie was going to provide centers for education where people could find their American dream in a library, reading the books, building themselves up the exact same way that he had done as a boy. There were other ventures that Carnegie was interested in as well, though, and other philanthropies he wanted to donate money to. Carnegie was a great lover of the arts, and in New York City, there is a beautiful structure that still exists today called Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall has welcomed various musicians and orchestras and opera singers and people like that to come to New York and perform, all under the donations of Carnegie, who had this magnificent structure built. And for those who get to perform at Carnegie Hall, if you look out at the audience, Carnegie basically, with his money and this hall, made a lot of dreams come true as well for various performers across the country. But Carnegie wasn't quite done there, and one of his shining pride and joy monuments that he has to this day is Carnegie Mellon University, which he started up with another investor. I can never remember Mellon's first name. It escapes me right now. But Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, is well known as a great research center in the Midwest. So when it's all said and done, the legacy of Andrew Carnegie is not just as someone who dominates the post-Civil War steel industry, but someone who used those funds to make society around him better. And even in this modern day and age, the Carnegie Foundation is still, long after his death, is still responsible for improving things for people in America and overseas in terms of education. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.